The world today is moving through one of the most unpredictable periods in modern politics. Alliances are shifting, trade relationships are under strain, and global stability is being tested by the actions of one powerful figure, Donald Trump. Tariffs are increasingly used as strategic tools. Economic threats have become a regular part of international negotiations, and long-standing allies are suddenly finding themselves treated more like competitors than trusted partners. Yet, while this turbulence spreads across the global system, one leader has taken a noticeably different approach. Instead of escalating confrontation, threatening partners, or fueling instability, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has chosen another path entirely. He has focused on building alliances, strengthening economic partnerships, and quietly demonstrating.
I think it's a bit of a reminder that the job of Prime Minister at this point, and maybe going forward, is increasingly international, and you can't sort of treat foreign affairs and visits to other countries as sort of a secondary concern.
To understand why Carney's leadership is drawing global attention, it is important to first understand the environment in which he is operating. The international system that existed for decades is now under significant strain. For many years, countries like Canada depended on stable and predictable relationships with allies. Trade agreements were dependable. Diplomatic cooperation followed well-established patterns. But Donald Trump dramatically altered that landscape. Under his leadership, tariffs have become a central political tool. Allies have been threatened with economic penalties, and trade partnerships that once felt permanent now face constant uncertainty. Many analysts describe the situation as an economic storm moving through global markets. In Canada's case, sudden economic shocks can now be triggered simply by unpredictable decisions coming from Washington. That new reality has forced countries like Canada to reconsider how they operate within the global system. When a key partner becomes unpredictable, the logical response is to expand relationships.
I'll start with you, Rob. What did you make of the Prime Minister's handling of this? In this initial written statement saying that they supported the U.S. trying to get rid of nuclear capabilities in Iran, and then spending really days trying to make sure that people understood where he really stood on the issue.
I think it reflects the reality of where we are in Canada today, that economic typhoons are unleashed in Canada because of the twitch muscles of Donald Trump. So when a statement like that is crafted, it's crafted really, it was in this instance, for an audience of one, and that was Donald Trump. And we've seen that in the recent past. That statement that you read, that initial statement said that Canada supported the U.S. in its objective of trying to make Iran a non-nuclear state. Yeah. Well, when you say you support the U.S. these days, what you're saying is you're putting your trust in Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. And that's a difficult place to be, particularly when you don't have an audience of one. You've got a liberal caucus, you've got a domestic audience that does not want to be associated with Donald Trump. And I think what followed after that statement was a result of people putting that calculation into the machine.
That is exactly the strategy Mark Carney has been pursuing in response to this shifting global landscape. Rather than responding to pressure with anger or escalating political rhetoric, he has taken a more calculated and strategic approach focused on strengthening Canada's long-term position. Over the past several days, Carney traveled across the Indo-Pacific region, meeting leaders in India, Australia, and Japan while advancing discussions aimed at expanding Canada's economic partnerships. These visits were not symbolic diplomatic gestures designed simply for headlines or photographs. They were centered on real economic cooperation, capable of reshaping Canada's trade relationships in the years ahead. Conversations during the tour focused heavily on industries expected to define the future global economy, including energy exports, critical minerals, resilient supply chains, advanced technologies, and long-term investment partnerships. By emphasizing these sectors, Carney is connecting Canada with some of the fastest-growing economic regions in the world, while positioning the country as a reliable supplier of resources and technology that modern economies increasingly depend on. The strategy is both simple and significant. The more partnerships Canada builds globally, the less vulnerable it becomes to pressure from any single nation. In an era where economic threats are often used as political leverage, expanding partnerships becomes one of the strongest strategies available to any country. This is also where the contrast between Carney and Trump becomes particularly clear. Trump's strategy relies heavily on leverage. If the United States is your primary trading partner, Washington can impose tariffs, pressure industries, and demand concessions. But that strategy works only if countries have few alternatives. Carney's approach moves in the opposite direction. Instead of accepting dependence, he is gradually reducing it. Rather than relying on a single market, he is developing relationships across multiple continents. That shift changes the balance of power. When Canada strengthens partnerships with countries like India, Australia, and Japan, it gains something extremely valuable: options. And in international politics, the country with more options almost always holds more influence. Analysts increasingly argue that the role of a prime minister has fundamentally evolved. Foreign policy is no longer secondary to domestic politics. It has become central to leadership itself. Today, a prime minister must constantly engage with international partners, secure new markets, and reinforce diplomatic relationships around the world. That is precisely what Carney has been doing. In a volatile global environment shaped by Trump's unpredictability, standing still simply is not possible. Countries must actively strengthen alliances, expand trade networks, and...
The Prime Minister in Japan, where he wrapped up a 10-day trade tour with stops in India, Australia, and Japan, obviously. How effective were the Prime Minister's trade missions? It was a big, long trip, Aaron, and there appeared to be a lot of deals that were begun or signed about energy, trade, critical minerals. How important is it that the Prime Minister keep these trips up, even as Dominic LeBlanc is trying to get things back on the rails with the United States?
Yeah, I don't think there's really much of an option at this point. I think it's a bit of a reminder that the job of Prime Minister at this point, and maybe going forward, is increasingly international. And you can't sort of treat foreign affairs and visits to other countries as sort of a secondary concern. Obviously, the thing that always gets said coming out of these trips is, it remains to be seen what the things that were signed amount to and sort of what comes next. But I think that's sort of a long-term play. And, obviously a lot of what happened this week was overshadowed by Iran, understandably and for good reason. But I think this is really, an indication that this is kind of the way things have to work from now on, that the Prime Minister has to spend a lot of time abroad, has to spend a lot of time in capitals, both shoring up trade relationships, but also, shoring up relationships with allies.
What makes Carney's strategy especially notable is that it reflects a fundamentally different philosophy of leadership in global politics. While Donald Trump has often relied on pressure, confrontation, and economic threats as negotiating tools, Carney has focused on strengthening alliances and deepening cooperation among democratic partners. This contrast is becoming increasingly visible on the world stage. At a time when geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainty are rising, many governments are searching for partners who offer stability and reliability. Countries want relationships built on predictable policies, consistent diplomacy, and leadership that encourages cooperation rather than undermines it. Under Mark Carney's leadership, Canada is gradually stepping into that role. By expanding relationships across regions like the Indo-Pacific while maintaining strong ties with traditional partners in Europe and North America, Canada is positioning itself as a country capable of navigating global volatility without contributing to the instability itself. In a world where trust between nations is becoming harder to sustain, that kind of steady leadership is attracting considerable international attention. When historians eventually examine this period, they may describe it as a turning point in global politics, a time when the international system was shaken by disruption and confrontation, but also a moment when some leaders chose a different direction. Donald Trump chose disruption. Mark Carney chose diplomacy. Trump relied on pressure. Carney emphasized partnerships. And the result is that while the global system continues to evolve, Canada is working to ensure it does not fall behind. Instead, under Carney's leadership, the country is helping shape what the next phase of international cooperation may look like. If you want clear analysis of the major geopolitical developments shaping Canada and the wider world, make sure you subscribe to Canada Today and turn on notifications so you never